Hi, and welcome to the Wex. If we haven't met yet, my name is Alana Ryder, and I'm manager for public and university programs. I'm delighted to introduce you this afternoon to Kevin Boyle, William Smith Mason Professor of American History at Northwestern University. Kevin taught at Ohio State for 11 years, so it's great to have him back in Buckeye Nation. Artist LaToya Ruby Frazier, here today, proposed that we bring Kevin to the Wex during her exhibition, The Last Cruise, now in our galleries until April 26th. We are incredibly grateful that this exhibition, as LaToya calls, quote, a monument and commemoration to the United Auto Workers and the Lordstown community, has connected us to the General Motors workers and their families, just 150 miles from here. The exhibition creates a platform for their voices as they articulate urgent needs that affect all of us. Further, the photographs and text on view serve as vital counter-narratives. They allow us to see what's happening in Ohio, what's absent from headlines and news coverage. Of note, I hope you will return on March 30th for a roundtable discussion with LaToya, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, and current and former presidents of Local 1112, Timothy O'Hara and David Green. I'm glad to speak with you further about this following the presentation, and please see our website for all other upcoming programs. To return to today's topics, Kevin teaches courses on U.S. history, the civil rights movement, racial violence, and working class history, among other subjects. To just provide a snippet from Kevin's formidable CV, his books include The UAW and the Heyday of American Liberalism, 1945 to 1968, Muddy Boots and Ragged Aprons, Images of Working Class Detroit, 1900 to 1930, and The Arc of Justice, a saga of race, civil rights, and murder in the Jazz Age, winner of the 2004 National Book Award for Nonfiction. He's currently in the midst of two book projects, The Splendid Dead, on political extremism and repression in the early 20th century, and The Splintering, a narrative history of the 1960s. He has held fellowships from places like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Thanks to you all for being here, and I'm sure Kevin would be glad to answer questions after the talk. Please welcome Kevin Boyle.
So I don't know if I need this, but I guess it would just be polite to use it. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the Wexner Center and to Alana particularly for all the work you put in and for giving me the chance to come back to campus. It just feels so much fun to come back to a place. It doesn't seem like that long ago that I left, actually. Randy is thinking it's really not that long. And really, you didn't need an introduction because I pretty Thank you all very much for coming. I also really want to thank LaToya Frazier for, we had lunch this morning or lunchtime, and I said to her then that I really feel incredibly honored and incredibly grateful that I got to, what? Oh, you want, do you need this? Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me? Good. I can. Always somebody. That I get the chance to have this very small way of joining in her really extraordinary exhibit. And I just want to say that it is beyond me what you are doing here. That why you are here to listen to me, when what you really ought to do is, I'm not advising you to do this, get up and go over and see the exhibit, if you haven't been to the exhibit, because that's the extraordinarily powerful thing. But I really don't want you to do that, at least not right now. So what I did instead is I brought one tiny bit of the exhibit into the room. I brought this gorgeous photo of Vicki Raymond sitting in her mother's bedroom in the house where Vicki Raymond grew up, in a tiny little place, East Rochester, Ohio. Anybody from No, of course not. It's 300 people that live in East Rochester. It's a crossroads, about 30 miles south of the Lordstown plant. It's in the middle of nowhere on a country road. It's a little farmhouse that her parents bought when they were first married. Her dad was a city kid. He was born outside of Pittsburgh, but he grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Cleveland. But her mom was from the country. She was from a tiny little seam of farmland right along the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. If you're a country music fan, it's not that far from Pigeon Forge. So I don't know this, but my guess is that her dad bought the house for her mom. The house wasn't in great shape when they bought it. It's a gorgeous text that goes along with this photo. And what Vicki says in that text is that the house, which was over 100 years old, was built in the 1890s. Well, it wasn't quite 100 years old when she bought it. Wasn't in great shape. Where the insulation should be, people had stuffed newspapers to keep the wind from blowing in. And over the years, they fixed it up. That's it. They put on the new siding. They installed new windows. They remade the inside, put in a newer kitchen inside. They built a nice deck out back. Did most of the work themselves. All of it paid through the 34 years that her dad worked in the Lordstown plant. And when Vicki was in her early 20s, her dad got her hired into the plant too. I just read this morning that he gave her 2 bits of advice when he went into the plant. First, she went into the trim line, and then to the paint room. He gave her 2 bits of advice. Never lend anyone any money. Don't take any shit. I don't know if all you guys know this, but there's a phrase for that generational passing over that people in the auto industry, folks who work in the auto industry use. They were a GM family. Her dad retired from the plant in 1999. Lived another 14 years till he died of prostate cancer. And after his death, her mom couldn't really keep up the place herself. And so while Vicki, she didn't live here, she lived in a town a little ways over from here, she'd come over after the shift every day and do the cleaning, do the vacuuming, do the sweeping. And when the weather was decent, she would do all that outside work to keep the house up. Then in, I think, 2017 or maybe early 2018, her mom was diagnosed with cancer too. And so Vicki took a 6-month unpaid leave to take care of her mom. And when that 6 month was up, she had to go back to the plant. She went back to the plant in November of 2018. She was only in the plant a little bit on shift when one morning the manager called the entire workforce in to say that the plant was being unallocated. This is the way she described it. She said, I didn't know what that meant. When they said unallocated, we all looked at each other like, what's that mean? They wouldn't say they were closing the doors, but our supervisor said that's what it meant. It was a state of shock. I mean, 24 years, and you get pulled into a couple of minutes meeting. Now, according to the union contract, workers who get laid off in the UAW shop have a right to transfer to another plant. And they'd already shut down the first 2 shifts. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. The first 2 shifts had already been shut down the previous year. And a lot of those people had been transferred out to the plant outside of Dallas. And when Vicki's mom heard about that layoff, that they were going to be shutting down, unallocating the plant, Her mom, who by this time was dying, said to Vicki, you know, if they offer you that, you ought to take it. By that point, Vicki was sleeping at nights on the sofa outside her mom's bedroom to make sure she was going to be okay. She was in in-home hospice care by that point. But her mom wanted to make sure that she'd be okay. She asked for one thing. She said that after she passed, what she wanted Vicki to do was that she wanted her to sell the house. Don't let it sit empty. Sell the house. Because it just wouldn't be right after all the work they put into that house, that it might just sit empty. And it seems to me that that's the heart of what Ms. Fraser's amazing exhibit tells us. The essence, for me, of that amazing exhibit. It's an exhibit about the shutting down of the Lordstown plant and about the process of deindustrialization that that's a part of. And it is a huge loss. In 1966, which was the year the plant opened, Ohio had about 1.2 million manufacturing jobs. 40% of the jobs in Ohio in 1966 were manufacturing jobs. Today, I know 2016 is not today. Would you just blame my old friend Bill Shakurti for the graph? Today, it's fewer than 700,000 jobs are manufacturing jobs in the state of Ohio. That's a drop from 40% of the jobs in Ohio down to about 12, 13% of the jobs in Ohio are manufacturing jobs. That is a catastrophic loss. And a huge amount of public attention over the years, over the decades really, has dealt with the question, at least talked about, the question of deindustrialization. And the heart of that conversation over and over again is how do we bring manufacturing back? As if there is something mythical about manufacturing. And it's bipartisan. When Barack Obama said how we should build a new economy in America in 2012, he said the heart of that economy, the foundation of the new economy, has to be manufacturing. And Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016 in part by saying he was going to restore manufacturing. He was going to bring the jobs back. He went to Lordstown and said he was going to bring the jobs back. Don't sell your house, he said, because those jobs are coming back. A claim that the folks down in Lordstown still are so pissed off about. But when you go through this amazing exhibit, one of the things that I noticed that kind of jumped out at me is that the folks in their testimony, the people from Lordstown, they don't talk about their jobs all that much. A little bit. People take pride in their work. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the main theme of what they talk about. What they talk about is the world they built for themselves with those jobs. That's what they see slipping away. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time up here today talking about. Now for the history stuff. You knew that was coming. Here's the thing. That when we today talk about auto manufacturing, auto jobs, we think of that as the gold standard of manufacturing work. That is not how the vast majority of Americans thought about auto work for the first, say, 4 decades, 5 decades really, of auto work. Auto work was considered the most degraded form of labor. That when auto manufacturing began in the United States in the early days of the 20th century, the turn of the century, people built cars, teams of workers, skilled workers, built cars from the bottom up. That's what this photo is. Skilled craftsmen building entire cars as teams of workers. It was a slow process that required a great deal of skill. Because most of you, a number of you happen to know, I'm from Detroit, I know a lot about cars. Vicki, my wife Vicki, she laughed. I can't change the oil in my car. I have to call AAA if there's a flat. But I do know cars have a lot of parts. I don't know if you noticed this, but there's a lot of parts in that thing. They built them from the ground up. It took about 12 hours to build your typical car. And the great genius of American auto manufacturing, the transformational part of auto manufacturing, was the tailorization of that job. Which is to say, what the great innovators of the American automobile industry did, Henry Ford, the quintessential one, but he's not the only one, is they took this complex work, they broke it down into minute pieces, so that skilled workers didn't have to do it, unskilled workers could do that job. And then they took all those small pieces and they put them along in a carefully sequenced process in which those unskilled workers, for the most part, could use particular tools to do their one job. And the pace of work was defined not by how your team worked together, but by a mechanized system of machine-driven pulleys and chains. In other words, they built an assembly line. They did not invent the assembly line. For those of you who are historians, the great innovation in actually creating assembly lines were the meat packing plants of the late 19th century, where you could move a carcass along and de-assemble an animal. They brought it to this level of manufacturing. And that is exactly what made Henry Ford and the other innovators of the industry fabulously wealthy men, some of the wealthiest men in America, because what that allowed them to do was A, to drive down their wage bill dramatically. You replace skilled labor with unskilled labor. To drive down your time to completion of the product. They cut, Henry Ford, with the innovation of the assembly line he put in place in Detroit, he cut the time to make a car by 5/6. When you do that, you drive down the cost. And when you do that, you can expand your market. The typical car, before the innovations of the assembly line in the United States, cost twice the annual income of a typical worker in America. They were luxury items. Henry Ford made it so that the middle class could afford this product. Not the working class. That's a great myth. But the middle class could afford this product, and there's a lot more of them. So they made themselves fabulously wealthy. There was only one problem with this system. Workers hated this system because this was repetitive, physically demanding, sometimes incredibly dangerous work to do. The annual labor turnover rate in Henry Ford's Highland Park plant when he introduced the assembly line was just a subtle 360%. He had to change the entire workforce, numerically speaking, 3.5 times every year because nobody wanted this work. People couldn't stand this work. His absentee rate was 10%. People didn't show up to work, and then when they showed up, they quit. That's why he introduced the $5 day, at least one of the reasons why he introduced the famous $5 day in 1914, because it was the only way, doubling workers' wages, to get them to stay. And the thing is, even that didn't work particularly well. Wages in auto did remain relatively high compared to other manufacturing in the early days. But it still didn't solve the problem of workers hating their jobs. And so what he and other auto manufacturers did is they laid onto that system. I love this photo. The classic American drive system inside factories, which is to say that what you do is you set production quotas, and that's a relatively easy thing to do when the pace of work is determined by machinery. And then you break down your workforce into small groups, unskilled workers doing a single job, like assembling the seating. And then you put in charge of them a foreman, whose entire job is to drive his workers as hard as he conceivably can, because his job depends on them meeting those strict production quotas. And he's given free rein to do essentially as he pleased in order to drive up those production levels. Henry Ford opened his famous Rouge plant in bits and pieces, mostly from 1919, 1918 forward. It was considered the marvel of the industrial world. People from around the world, experts, engineers from around the world would come to see the fabled Ford Rouge plant because it was the ultimate model of modernist production. 75,000 workers worked in that plant in the 20s. But down on the shop floor, it was this patchwork of petty tyrannies. That patchwork then knit together by Ford's infamous security service. Its thuggish security service. I was kind of proud of this, I once wrote that it was run by the thuggish son Henry Ford always wished he'd had. A man by the name of Harry Bennett. And to make life harder for auto workers, auto work was incredibly unstable. Now that's true of workers across American industry in the 19th and early 20th century. Unless you were a skilled worker, you didn't work a 52-week job. Almost every unskilled worker or semi-skilled worker in the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century had some stretch of a year where you were laid off. Because inventories would start to pile up, not just auto, but all sorts of inventories would start to pile up, and then they'd lay you off for a stretch of time till they could clear their inventories again. And the auto industry was particularly prone to that. So those wages were high, but your annual wage wasn't particularly high because you had a stretch of time where you weren't employed. And General Motors, great innovation in the auto industry. You know what General Motors' greatest innovation in the auto industry was besides the Vega? Exactly. It's model changeover. So that every year you come out with a new model. Henry Ford infamously didn't do that, right? Built the Model T till everyone's got one. GM figured, well, now you change the dashboard and you say, now the 1922 models are out. That meant that there was inevitably a time, usually in August, where they shut down the plants for retooling. And everybody was off for a month, except whoever was doing the retooling. To make that even harder in the auto industry, autos, while Henry Ford drove down the price dramatically, it was still one of the most expensive things you were ever going to buy. And what that meant was that when times got tough, you don't buy a new car. It was given to this incredible market volatility. There was a serious depression in the United States in 1920-21. The auto industry slashed production by 60%. Huge layoffs. When the Depression hit in 1929, the next one, hit in 1929, between 1929 and 1932, the auto industry sales plummeted by 75%. So your life was this incredible kind of roller coaster if you worked inside an auto industry. So I guess what I'm saying is that inside the auto industry, what it meant to be an auto worker in the United States wasn't that you were kind of the golden child of industrial production. What it meant was that you worked in a job that when you came home at night from your shift, You couldn't stop the involuntary twitching of your hand because you just spent 10 hours doing the same motion over and over again at a pace you didn't set. It meant that you came home with scars up and down your arms from the metal shavings that you were cutting off the engine blocks to get them ready to be inserted into the cars. It meant you came home feeling the toxicity of the paint room in your chest because they were toxic, they were poisonous. It meant that you couldn't complain about any of that or anything else because your foreman had supreme power over you. And to complain meant that you might lose your job. It meant that, yeah, you got decent wages, but you better be able to stretch them out because there's going to be a time in the year where you're not going to have any income at all, and you better have some savings. And you can't afford to have someone in your family get sick. And you can't afford to grow old. That's what it meant to be an auto worker in the United States in the early 20th century. Until the Union came. Oh, look at that, it was cool. I love this. I do this, I put these slideshows together, they're really very impressive. Then I forget to show them to you. This is a shot, I believe, of the Packard plant in Detroit. A little later, if you look at the cars there, you realize it's not exactly the 1930s. Unionization came to the United States in the auto industry, in two key stages. The first was 1935. 1935, I know I'm preaching to some people who know this back of their hands. In 1935, the federal government passed, Congress passed, and the President, Franklin Roosevelt, signed into law the National Labor Relations Act. It was and is the fundamental labor law in the United States. One tiny bit of background, in the United States, throughout most of American history, unions were very weak. And business was very powerful and profoundly anti-union. What the National Labor Relations Act said, and now I'm going to impress you with my deep historical knowledge because I am now about to quote the National Labor Relations Act. It said that workers have a right to join a union of their own choosing, free of employer interference. That was it. You're supposed to be really impressed now. Thank you. I had nothing to do with that. I just quoted it. What that meant in practice was that the federal government was guaranteeing workers the right to choose their representatives and to stop employers from a whole series of practices that they had been using to block unionization. It listed a whole bunch of things employers couldn't do to block unionization. And then it created a federal agency, the National Labor Relations Board, to manage elections, to run elections in factories that workers could then use to decide if they wanted to join a union or not, and it was majority rules. Majority of workers said they wanted to join a particular union, that group was unionized. And this is another cool photo that I ripped off of Google Images. This is the NLRB in action. I wish it were an auto industry. It's not, it's Jones and Laughlin. But it gives you a very strong sense of what this actually meant. You got these federal bureaucrats to come in, and they got these guys, he's coming out of the voting booth right there. You're bringing democracy into the plant. And that was step one, the creation of that act. Now, what that act didn't do was it didn't give workers, didn't create the unions themselves. Just gave them a mechanism for that to happen. The next step for the auto industry were the most militant moments, some of the most militant moments in labor action in the 20th century. In two different sit-down strikes, the first in Flint in January and February of 1937, and then mostly in Detroit in Chrysler plants in March of 1937, auto workers took the most militant action by seizing their plants, the plants in which they worked, and demanding to have union recognition and refusing to leave them until that was granted. That's a somewhat militant thing to do. And through those two militant strikes, in Flint in January and February, and in Chrysler in March, they unionized two of the three major auto manufacturers. Took another, I can do the math, 4 years for them to unionize Ford. And the Ford strike, this is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo actually, the Ford strike happened pretty much as a shop floor rebellion, surging up out of the Rouge, out of those petty tyrannies, up off the shop floor into sweeping into the greatest factory in the world. In this rage of unionization. And from there, from that, organizing those three major manufacturers, then they organized the smaller manufacturers, the parts plants, so that by the late 1940s, the UAW was one of the largest unions in the world, had over 1 million members at its peak, and was generally the second largest union in the United States for decades and decades. Now, there is vast scholarship on the nature of the post-war UAW. Dave knows better than just about anybody in the room. It's a lot of argument about the nature of the post-war UAW. I am not going to tell you that. You would like to be somewhere else. You don't really want to hear historiography at the moment. I'll just say that, sure, why not? I like historiography. I am happy to talk about that later. Let me just say the UAW was never a perfect institution. It wasn't. I'm not too sure how many perfect institutions there are out there, but it wasn't a perfect institution. But it did three extraordinary things. Three fundamentally important things. First, it brought to the shop floor a rule of law. It's the much maligned grievance system. And on the left, there have been criticisms of the grievance system for bureaucratizing industrial relations, and on the right, as a hamper to creativity. I once did a little research project, it was a long time ago now, where I took one auto plant in Detroit, and I read all of their grievance records from the time that that plant was unionized till the end of World War II. So those of you who aren't historians, this is what we do with our time. And I read them all. And the most common grievance that was filed in that plant was about job classification. Most boring thing you can find. I was a G7 and I really ought to be a G9. That's an argument about wages. And it's not a small thing. And the second most common in that plant was safety. Over and over again. The workers in that was a big plant. This was Jefferson Avenue Assembly, for any of you who are Detroiters. Local 7, for any of you who are UAW people. Second most common was safety, and the most common variation of safety, the most common thing workers wanted in that category, is they wanted gloves. So you don't go home with your hands ripped up. And that's not a small thing either. Another way of thinking about the grievance system is one UAW member way back in the day, he said, you know what a grievance system means? It means I can tell my boss he's a son of a bitch. That's Vicki too, right? Don't take shit from anybody. So that's one thing they did, is they brought to that system on the shop floor, that life on the shop floor, a rule of law. Second thing they did is they brought extraordinary benefits, pay and benefits to their membership. And the shorthand for that, as you will hear over and over again, is that they brought auto workers and made them middle class. That's not true. 1966, the year that Lordstown opened, the typical auto worker made $6,300 a year. Typical production worker. Not the skilled, that was higher. $6,300 a year was about 15% below the median income in the United States in 1966. Today, typical auto worker makes about $58,000 a year, which is 7% below the median wage in the United States. Auto workers are working class people, and their wages reflect that. But what those wages mean, what those benefits mean, is huge. Because what it means is that if you were an auto worker in this era, what it meant was that you didn't have to worry anymore what was going to happen if someone in your family got sick, because you had a health care plan. And you didn't have to worry anymore what it meant when you got too old to work anymore, when you couldn't just keep up with the speed of the line anymore and it was time to retire, because you had a retirement package. And you didn't actually have to worry about at least a short-term layoff, because what the UAW negotiated in the 1950s and 60s was something called the Supplemental Unemployment Benefit, which meant that at least in a short-term layoff, which grew longer and longer, you almost earned your complete wage while you were laid off. And it meant that you didn't have to worry about how you were going to pay the rent anymore, because maybe you were able to afford a home of your own. And maybe it was 1,200 square feet on a country road 30 miles south of the plant. And maybe you had to put up the siding yourself. And maybe you had to install the window yourself. And maybe you had to take some of those weekends that you now got off and build the deck out back for yourself. But it was your house. And there is enormous security and enormous dignity in that. Third thing that I want to bring up that the UAW did, not always intentionally, is that it made sure that a lot of what it brought to its members didn't just go to white men. Now, I want to be really clear on this. The UAW was not always perfect on racial and gender questions. That when the UAW first formed in the 1930s and 40s, some of its locals, some of its most important locals, were segregated locals. And a lot of the jobs were segregated, and they reinforced that segregation. So I'm not trying to say they were a perfect organization. But what they did do, because of the rhetoric, because of the language of what they were preaching as union solidarity, is they created a space, sometimes despite themselves, a space that ordinary workers, workers of color, women of all races could use to demand that the union live up to its equality. They created inside the labor movement, we were talking about this morning, a powerful civil rights movement. That African American workers, that Latinx workers, that women of all sorts of races could use to demand equal treatment. And it wasn't easy, and it wasn't a quick fight. And for African Americans in particular, there's a tragedy embedded in that, because the moments that they actually achieved a lot of that access, the jobs started to disappear. But when Vicki went into that plant, when you talk to her in the plant, what she says is that she worked all sorts of jobs when she was in her teens and 20s, and she wasn't paid equal to men's work. But in UAW, she was. And you see that in Ms. Fraser's extraordinary exhibit. You see people like Lewis Robinson, like Sherry Duncan and her family. Because the UAW wasn't just about white men, but about a full range of people. And that's what solidarity means. Now, there's also a big argument in the scholarship about this point I'm about to make. But what the heck, I think it's wrong, so I'm just going to assert it. The major manufacturers never accepted unionization. They bargained. They didn't have any choice. The law said you had to bargain once those recognition came in those strikes. And they made good deals. They agreed to good deals because they were making profits hand over fist in the 1950s and 60s. And when you're making profits hand over fist, you don't want to shut down. But they never accepted the idea of unionization. And if they could have figured out a way around it, they would have. And they tried. And the classic example of that is automation. That almost as soon as unionization came in the auto industry, certainly right after the war, World War II, what companies started to do, and GM was a classic of this, was try to introduce technologies they could use, yes, to speed up production, there's no doubt about that, but also to drive down the size of their workforce. And robotics is the classic example of that. It was slow. There were smaller examples of that. Robotics is the dramatic one. I did another study once, another small little study about working on the trim line. And one of the huge changes that came on the trim line was the introduction of the nail gun. Because once you automate how you put the tacking into upholstery, you've de-skilled that job. The old way you had to do it was you had to keep the tacks in your mouth and spit them on to the hammerhead as you put it down. That takes a little skill. I would not advise you trying that. But they introduced, in the late 40s, they introduced a nail gun. Changes the job. Robotics was the classic example. And I have to say, because I don't think it's a small point, Lordstown was part of that very process. Lordstown was opened in '66 as one of the most technologically sophisticated plants in the GM empire. It was meant to be a place where you could use automation at its highest levels. So it's part of this process that the auto companies had to kind of undermine the unionized wage force. But it was small. The fundamental transformation came in the 1970s, and I'm not going to, wow, this thing is, I love this one too. I forgot I put this up here. This is Lordstown in 1967. The heck is this guy doing here? I have a funny feeling he's not part of the union. But you can also see how automated it was. You can see a reflection of the exhibit. The Great Crisis comes in the 1970s, and it's an economic crisis, and it comes in all sorts of forms, and you don't want to hear me go through all of that, so I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version. From the late 1960s on, and certainly in a couple of really critical years, and they aren't hard to see, 74, 75, down here 80, 81, the United States economy went through a whole series of interlocking upheavals. One of them was a fundamental transformation in the world financial markets, really triggered by the Vietnam War. One was the spiking of inflation. You can certainly see that here. The red's the inflation rate, up a little over 10% in 1980. And then a series of energy shocks, the famous energy shocks of the 1970s. And what they did together is they created a crisis of profitability. 1980, General Motors lost $768 million. That was the first time that General Motors went into the red since 1921. It was a huge crisis of profitability. And what that crisis then did is it intersected with fundamental changes in American public life and American public policy. Now, there are a lot of reasons for the turn to the right that came in American public policy in the late 70s and the 1980s. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's not simply an economic argument. It's not simply that there was a crisis of profitability in that period. But that's not coincidental either. And then what public policy, there's a lot of changes in public policy, but there's a couple of them that are particularly important. One was that from 1981 on, there was a dramatic pull away from the right of unionization in the United States. The National Labor Relations Act is still the fundamental law in the United States, but its enforcement has been fundamentally undermined. And that's been a continual process since 1981 on. The second one are fundamental transformations in trade law and trade markets. General Motors opened its first major Mexican part plant for the American market. They had part plants in Mexico from the 1930s on for the Mexican market, but they opened their first part plant to make parts for the United States in 1978. That timing is not coincidental because it's perfectly fitting with that crisis of profitability. By the turn of the century, so by the year 2000, they had 50 parts plants. They were employing in Mexico 72,000 workers. And then the third fundamental transformation in American public policy was the gutting of the private sector, the undercutting of public education, the undercutting of public housing, the undercutting of what was always a patchwork welfare state. And what those changes then did is they intersected with economic strategies for major corporations like General Motors to create that crisis of deindustrialization that we now see in cities like Flint, in cities like Detroit, in cities like Cleveland. The intense spiral of poverty in those cities, where the public sector has been so starved, so eviscerated, that it can't provide its people with the most basic of things, like clean water. And that's the transformation that then reached Lordstown in 2018. Now, folks could see it coming, because until 2017, till January I think it is, of 2017, Lordstown ran 3 shifts. And then they shut down, GM shut down the third shift in January of 2017, and then it shut down the second shift in early 2018. So that workforce had been shrinking pretty intensely for about a year and a half before that day in November of 2018 when management informed them that the plant was being shut down completely. And the workers in Lordstown, as is beautifully documented, tried to force GM to change its mind, tried to shame them, really, into changing their mind. And they couldn't do that. The plant shut down in March 2019. The last cruise rolled off in March 2019. And since then, there have been a couple of things that have happened in Lordstown. First is GM sold the plant to a startup company that said that it was going to be making electric trucks. And they have said that they would employ somewhere upwards of 400 workers. There were 1,600 on that shift, that last shift. But there's no guarantee whatsoever that those will be union jobs. And then GM has recently announced that in a joint venture with a South Korean company, they want to open a new battery plant in Lordstown, pretty much right next to the old plant. And that when it's fully operational, they think they could bring up to 1,400 new jobs. And to build that new plant, they have recently gotten a multi-year tax abatement, a good hunk of which will be paid out of the coffers of the Lordstown School District to reopen a plant next to the one they shuttered. And if those 1,400 jobs happen to come, what projections say is that their wage rates there will be about half of what they were in Lordstown Assembly. And there, it seems to me, is where we see that the real threat of our fixation on deindustrialization, if reindustrialization is the answer to this economic crisis, of bringing those jobs back in. The American economy isn't helped by creating jobs at half the wage rates, industrial jobs at half the wage rates of what the old one did. That's not the answer. There's nothing wonderfully golden about having a job at half the wage rate you used to have to make car batteries. What we need to do as a society, it seems to me, what we need to do is we need to make it so that the economic power of that Union era, of that era in which ordinary people could make enough to afford their health care, afford to retire, afford to own a little home. What we need to do is we need to bring that system to the economy we do have so that it's possible. That the young people who serve you, or the older people who serve you at McDonald's, make $30 an hour. Or the Uber driver has health care coverage. Or the woman who cares for your young child at the child care, or your elderly parent in the nursing home, has good union wages. What we need to do is bring that system of security and dignity to the people who greet you when you walk into the Walmarts. Not dream of restoring a golden age of manufacturing, but dream of creating a more just economy. I'm an historian. I don't know how to do that. Do I believe that a central piece of that is unionization? Absolutely. We ought to enforce the laws we've got. We ought to make it possible for all sorts of working people to join unions and find the solidarity they offer. And we ought to support workers who do that. There are other pathways too. I'm not going to lay them all out for you. You know as much as I do, probably a heck of a lot more than I do, what those pathways are. But there are other pathways too. There are other policies that we could put in place, other ways we can see the world. And that's the heart of it seems to me. That what we have to be able to do is to imagine that the way things are not the ways they have to be. Even though sometimes it seems that way. Vicki's mother died of cancer in January of 2019. She held her while she died. And she went back into the plant for a couple of months until it shut down. And then Vicki did get offered another position in GM, and she took it in Kentucky, 500 miles south of that house. And the reason that I'm able to show you that house, because they did put it up for sale, because she promised her mom she would. $135,000, they put it up for sale. 5 acres of land, 1,200 square feet, $135,000. They couldn't find a buyer. And so just a couple of months ago, they pulled it off the market. And it's sitting empty. Waiting for better days. Thank you so much for coming.